All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is Reason Prep's live stream number 4. My name is Rob Shums. I'm the founder of Reason Prep. I'm the person who does all the videos on YouTube, on my website, all the articles, all the good stuff like that, all the courses, and so on. So the purpose of this live stream is to answer any questions that you might have on the SAT, the ACT, the SAT subject tests, particularly in math and chemistry and literature, and even any general questions you might have about college admissions, anything like that. So let me just check my tech just to make sure everything's good. Looks like we are set there. Looks like the stream is going. So the purpose of the session, as I said, is to go over any questions. So if you have questions, feel free to send them. So you can send questions to ask@reasonprep.com. And if you do send questions that way, and they're specific questions about SAT or ACT tests or whatever, please include the answer to the question, an image of the question if possible, and the source if possible. So is it from a real test? Is it from a Barron's book, or wherever it might be from? If you have more general questions about the SAT or the ACT, what I recommend is you make them as specific as you can. So a question like, how do I go from an 1100 to a 1400? Very difficult to answer. But if you can narrow that down and maybe ask about a specific test or a specific question type or a specific problem you're having, the more narrow the question, the better the answer. So it's really for me to give a good answer for you, and maybe an answer that can help a lot of people. So like I said, if you want to send me a question, you can send it by email, or you can post it in the chat. I usually prioritize email questions over chat questions. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so a question about Khan Academy reading. I've talked about this previously in previous live streams and in other videos and such. My thoughts on Khan Academy reading. And so the problem with reading practice that's anything other than official SAT stuff from the College Board is it's really hard to get official reading material to be good. It's really hard to get practice reading material to be good, to meet the quality of official questions for all kinds of reasons, which I won't go into. Now, technically, Khan Academy, they claim, is working with the College Board to make sure their questions are good, I guess. But I'm not super convinced, actually, that they're probably working with them, but it's not with the same degree of intensity that the College Board works on their tests and their questions. I mean, the College Board, when they create an SAT, that goes through a very rigorous process to vet every question. And I guarantee you they're not doing that for Khan Academy questions. So even if they were working with them closely, the quality is not going to be still at that level. And just from what I've seen in the practice questions for reading, it's just it falls into the same kind of problems that other prep books run into when it comes to reading questions. And it's no fault of their own. It's just really hard to do. It requires a lot of time and effort and vetting of the questions, which really no one but the College Board, who has the time and money to do that, can really do. So if you want to practice reading, I don't recommend using Khan Academy if you can avoid it. Stick with, at first, real tests. Then if you run out of real tests, I actually do recommend using old SAT reading. You can skip the vocabulary questions, the sentence completions, of course, but you can also use the old SAT reading as, I think, a good substitute. If you run out of those, or you don't like that or whatever, then I guess, Khan Academy reading's fine. Any third-party material is fine, but you're not going to get anything as good as you'll get from the College Board. So try to stick with them as much as possible. I have a whole video on this on YouTube called what to do when you run out of tests, basically, for the SAT. And I go through this in more detail. So if you want to check out that video, you can. Okay, I have a question. It looks like a... Oh, and as a side note, Khan Academy math and writing is fine. That's good for practice. It's just the reading. It's just hard to do. Really, no one can do it well except for the College Board. And this also applies for the ACT as well. ACT reading, much better to get practice sections out of real tests than anything third-party created. So a circle in this plane contains these points, which the following is an equation of the circle. So for questions like these, I don't know, is there a way? And maybe we can see that the center of the circle would have to be 0, 0, and then maybe find the radius based on that. But in any event, regardless of that, what I would do is just plug in values and see which one of these equations works with these points. So for example, in C, which is what was put originally, if I plug in 1, 1, I'm going to get 1 minus 1 minus 2 equals, well, that equals negative 2, doesn't equal 0, so it can't be C. But if I plug it into A, I'm going to get 1 plus 1 minus 2 is 0. That works. If I plug it into B, it's not going to work. If I plug it into D, it's not going to work. So the answer is A. So I would just plug in for a question like this. Whenever you're given points or values and you want to match it to an equation, no matter what that equation is, I recommend plugging in values. It's just so much easier than trying to solve this directly. Is it easy to solve this directly? Let's see. 1, 1, negative 1, 1. Yeah, maybe this doesn't have a radius of 2. This is why, again, trying to do it... Well, yeah, I guess you could find the radius by finding the distance from the center to the point, but this gets complicated. Just plug it in. It's so much easier. All right, next question. More of a general question, how can I push my SAT English up to a 730 from a 650 to a 680? So by English, I guess we're meaning both the reading and the writing. So this is the current level, and we want to get to 730. Again, a little general, hard to give really great answer to this question without knowing more about your situation and more about what you've done so far and what you're trying to do, the breakdowns of this in terms of reading, writing. I would say the main thing is try to squeeze as many points out of the writing as possible, because it's much easier to improve on the writing than it is on the reading, even if you're talking about the last 5 questions. It's much easier to get more of the last 5 questions right often than try to get more out of your reading, especially short term. So make sure that you're getting as close to a 40 in writing as you can, because that will do a lot of the work for you. Then you could afford to miss a bunch of questions and get down to a 33 in reading. So the main thing is squeeze as much as you can out of writing. Try to bury the reading score under a phenomenal writing score. And I think that is reasonable for most students, even short term, to get closer and closer to a 40. So my writing course can help with that. So if you haven't used it already, I would recommend going through that. Second, again, it's hard to know when we're talking about reading what mistakes you're making. So I don't know, I can't give really specific advice on what to do about reading. I guess that's the first question. I guess that's the main thing is, are there any consistent weaknesses in reading? Consistent weaknesses in reading. If you can find what those consistent weaknesses are, if, for example, you get the 2-part questions wrong consistently, if you have problems in dual passages, if you have problems in the history passage, then your consistent weakness would be something you could work on. And that might help you get another 10, 20, 30 points. Couple that with strength in writing. You're only looking at about 80 to 50 points here overall. So maybe 50 from writing, 30 from reading. You're where you want to be. So see if there's any consistent weaknesses and build on those strengths. Or build on those weaknesses, improve on those weaknesses. For those watching, you can send emails to send questions to ask@reasonprep.com. There's some instructions on the screen about what to do when you send those questions for best results. You can also ask questions in chat if you like, but I prioritize emailed questions. Okay. Next question is dual history passages. Oof, yeah. So history passages, I've talked quite a bit about this. I think the last live stream in particular. But then when you add dual history passages on top of it, it gets super tricky. So these are the passages where you've got passage 1 and passage 2, and they're both from the 19th century or the 18th century. And yeah, so not only do you have to work through the hard language of the history passage, which you've discussed before, really hard to do, but then you've got two of them, you have to compare and contrast them, and it's a big challenge. The most important thing for any dual passage, but especially for the dual history passage, is to get the relationship between the passages. This is critical. So we need to know, do these passages have an opposite relationship? Do they disagree? That's often how it's going to be, especially in a lot of the practice SATs that they've released, so far at least. The dual passages have been opposed. They've been on two sides of the same issue. So are they opposed? Do they disagree? Are they on the same side? Do they agree? Considerably rarer to see this, but it can happen. So two people writing about an issue upon which they mostly agree. They may have some minor disagreements, but the key is, do they agree about it overall? And then very rarely, I don't really think you'll see this anymore. This was more of like an old SAT type thing, but I'll include it just in case they bring it back. So no relationship. Sometimes you'll have two passages that maybe speak on the same topic, but they don't necessarily agree or disagree. They're just maybe approaching the topic in different ways with different methods. So there'd be no relationship in that case. So it's really important to know the relationship between these. And to do that, you need to understand, of course, the main arguments of each passage, and that's often where the difficulty comes in, right? So it's one thing to understand the relationship between them, but of course, to do that, you need to understand what the passages are even saying in the first place. So presenting main arguments is really key to understanding the relationship between these passages, and that's going to be important to understanding questions that relate to both passages, especially those that ask, what is the relationship between the passage, or whatever. I think what I'm going to have to do is go through one day, and maybe in a live stream, start it for the first 10 or 15 minutes, doing like a little mini lesson, and work through a reading of a dual history passage so you can see how we analyze it, how we break it down, because honestly, it's really hard to speak in generalities about it. Each passage is different, the language is different, the arguments are different. It really comes into just seeing practices. So I think what I'm going to do in a future session, maybe sometimes this week, I'll do another practice dual history passage, and at least a reading of it so you can see how that process might work. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough for everybody, native speakers, non-native speakers alike. Okay, so we have a question this was from test number 5. Released by, whoa, that's huge. Released by the College Board. So if you haven't done this test yet, you might not want to watch this. Spoiler alert. That's still massive. Oh my gosh. So this is from test 5. You may not want to watch this if you haven't done it, as I said, because it's from the test, and it might be just good practice to do it on your own. But if you have done this one, or if you don't care, then you can watch. Otherwise, you might want to turn away or not pay attention for a little bit. So let's try this one out. And so there's a couple questions attached to this email. How to understand this question by breaking it down. We'll definitely go through that. And are there different methods to solve this question? Maybe. Let's see what happens. Alan drives an average of 100 miles each week. His car can travel an average of 25 miles per gallon of gasoline. Alan would like to reduce his weekly expenditure on gasoline by $5, assuming gasoline costs $4 per gallon. Which equation can Alan use to determine how many fewer average miles, M, he should drive each week? So this question looks like a question where you have to set up an equation. And I suppose there's a way to do that, kind of almost more algebraically. But really the way I see this question, and you see this a lot with problems involving miles per gallon, miles, gallons of gasoline, cost, is this is really a unit conversion problem. So essentially, he wants to save $5. And if gas costs $4 per gallon, we want to know how many fewer miles he would have to drive in order to save that amount of money. So you can kind of see the chain of conversions. There's going to be M miles he's going to drive fewer. If he drives M fewer miles, he's going to use less gas. And if he uses less gas, he's going to pay less money for the gas that he didn't use, right, that he saved on. So there's a chain of conversions. And so what I recommend for unit conversion, instead of trying to think it through in your head, is to actually pull something, a tool out from chemistry, if you've done chemistry before. It's called dimensional analysis. And if you haven't done chemistry, I teach this in my courses, and I'm also going to show it to you right here, so you'll get a sense of how this works. So what we're going to do is we're going to convert M, let's see, which way would we do it? Would we convert 5 into M or M into 5? Let's see. Yeah, so we're going to convert $5. We want to see basically how many miles are there in $5. And what that's going to equal is that's going to equal M. That's going to equal the miles we're saving. So we're essentially going to convert $5 into M. So how will we do this? Well, we're going to start with $5, and then we do our first conversion. And what I want to do is convert this into gallons of gasoline. How many gallons of gas do I get out of $5? And the trick is whatever unit is on top, you're going to put on bottom, because what that's going to do is cancel the units. And the unit on top is going to be, in this case, gallons, because I'm converting from dollars to gallons. And I know from the problem that it's $4 per gallon. So I'm going to put that as my conversion. Next, I want to convert gallons to miles. So if he's going to save this amount of gallons, how many miles would that be equivalent to? So again, I'm going to put this unit on the bottom. I'm going to put miles on top. And in the problem, I'm told the conversion is 25 miles per gallon. So 1 gallon, 25 miles. And so through this process, dollars cancel, gallons cancel. What I'm left with is a value with the unit of miles. So whatever this ends up equaling, this is going to equal M. That's going to be the number of miles he's going to drive fewer miles he's going to drive so that he saves this $5. So what am I going to get? I'm going to get 5 over 4 times 25 is equal to M. Now, this is pretty close to one of the answers. I'm just going to do a little bit of a rearrangement here. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 4/5. And I'm going to get 4/5 M equals 25. And 4/5. Oh, okay, that doesn't even match into them either. So let's go back, because I need to have, looks like 25 on one side. So let's go here. So instead, I'm going to multiply both sides by 4 over 25. That will cancel these. And I'm left with 5 is equal to 4 over 25m. And that looks like it's choice D. And that's the answer. So that is the unit conversion way of doing this, which I like. It seems to make sense to me. There might be other ways to do it, which I'll think about in a second. I'm just going to check in, make sure I haven't missed anything in the chat or anything. Okay, are there other ways to do this? You could also convert it from M. Start with M miles, convert M miles into dollars, and then that should equal 5. I mean, it's the same method as this. You're just flipping the order of everything. So you could do that. Is there another way to do it? Yeah, I mean, you could also just, this is all kind of the same, but you can say, what would I have to do to M to turn it into $5? Cheating a little bit, looking at the choices. What would I have to do to M to convert that into $5? And then again, you could do something related to these conversions, but that to me is super unintuitive. I don't like that. So this method of dimensional analysis, factor label method sometimes it's called, helps organize your conversions one step to the next. And from that, you can get an equation. You also could just kind of ignore the M, actually calculate what M would equal. Get a number for M, because we can do that. When we actually calculate this value, we're going to get, looks like 125 over 4, I think. Get a value for M, and then see which one of these equations gives you that same value. So if you wanted to actually find the value of that, you could go to the choices and see which one's consistent once you find that M, and you will see that it's going to be D in that case. So that's another way to do it. Pretty tricky though, for sure. So a question in chat, could you go over grammar? That's really broad. That's like everything in the writing test. So if you can focus it a little bit more, maybe a grammar rule that you want to go over, or a particular question that you have from an SAT or something, or an ACT, we can definitely go over that, because if you want a complete review of the grammar rules for the SAT, I've got a free SAT writing course that covers all that. And for the ACT English Bootcamp, also free, covers all that. Both of them are available on YouTube, and you get more features if you join my site to watch those. And again, those are all free, totally free to watch those and join my site. So I recommend that. So if you want to narrow it a bit more, I can take a closer look at that. Oh, this is an interesting question. Somewhat controversial. Well, not really. I'm trying to pretend there's controversy in like SAT lands, because otherwise this stuff is just so boring. I'm trying to make it cool, but it's never going to be cool. Okay. Should I read the passage in the SAT writing section between two language questions that don't ask about the main idea? Because when I read the writing passages, that helps me in solving some question, but it wastes a lot of time. So the gist of this is, do I have to read the entire writing passage, especially if there's a big gap between questions? My thing about this is it's going to be dependent on your strength in the section and how well you're doing on others. Basically, when I do this, I say no, I don't. So I'm basically skipping from question to question. When I need to, I will go back and read if necessary. That's basically the position I take. I'm on notice that I'm going to have to go back and read if I need to. But most of the time, you're not going to need to, because most of the time, the answers to these questions are at most found within the paragraph you're reading. So reading like everything is not necessarily important. Let me actually pull out a reading test here. Let's just grab this one. And let me we'll look at a passage, and I'll kind of show you what I would do in terms of reading everything. Because you're right, if you're able to not read everything, that saves you some time. And I think you can get away with it in the writing section. So let's grab an example where there's a big gap, because I think that will... Honestly, these passages are so short. Unlike the ACT, this comes up, I think, more on the ACT than it does on the SAT. Because on the ACT, the passages in the writing section are bigger, and you get a lot more gaps. So this is a good example. So let me grab this passage out. Whoops. So this comes from Test 6. Don't worry if you haven't done this yet. We're not actually going to go through the questions. I'm going to... just talk about how I would read this passage, or how much of it I would read. So no worries if you haven't actually read this. So like I said, I'm typically going to jump around here. I'm not going to read every single word. So clearly to answer 23, I would probably read, depends on the question for 23. 23, okay, so 23, the question is, what choice is the best introduction to the paragraph? So I probably would skip this. I would do 24 and 25 first as I'm doing that reading through the paragraph, and then I'm ready to do 23. So I might jump around it like that, but I would read the entire paragraph here. Then I would definitely read the paragraph here, 26, 27, 28, 29. Here is kind of what you're talking about. Now, this question is one of these opening word questions where you have to find which word is best to start the sentence. With those, you need to read a little bit more than just the sentence. So I probably would read the whole paragraph, to be honest, and then read the whole thing. So yeah, I think really in practice, you're going to be reading basically everything. But if you can find moments where you can skip and save a little bit of time, because it's not going to ask questions about it, because sometimes you'll get actually like a whole paragraph that has no questions underlined. I think most of the time you can skip it and you'll be okay. And if you need to, if it turns out you need to read that, just go back and read it later. But it's not going to affect that many questions. How much time should I spend each day to improve my ACT scores? So I'm going to give a range because it depends. Let me copy and paste this. It's going to depend on kind of where you're at, how much time you have until the test, that kind of thing. But I can give a range. I can give you some suggestions. Now, actually go more into detail about this in my ACT study plan. For those of you who haven't joined my site, I've got a free course on ACT study plans. And so if you go to reasonprep.com and you go to the courses section of my website, you'll be able to find out more information about my SAT and ACT study plan. So this is what it looks like. You can just go to my website. So I talk more about that there. But to answer this question, oh man, I've really screwed everything up. Well, the question disappeared. So anyway, the question was, how much time should I spend on my ACT scores? Let me actually bring that back up because it's kind of important. Copy, paste. Okay. So again, it depends on your timeline. If you have, I forget exactly the breakdown I had for this, but this is approximate. If you've got more than 6 months until your next test, so if you're preparing early, and let me actually get my actual breakdowns just so I'm consistent with myself, because that would be confusing if I'm not. But long story short, if you're starting early in this process, you've got more than 6 months to your next test, then you can afford to take it easy. You don't have to cram. So what it's going to look like is, so I had it written on this as 4 months or more. Okay, so I'm going to change this to 4 months. So if you have more than 4 months until your next test, so again, if you're starting early, then I recommend 30 minutes per day on average, 4 days per week. Now, occasionally, maybe once per month with this kind of schedule, you'd want to do a full test, and then maybe a little bit more frequency with the full tests as you get closer, but never really more than once every 2 weeks. One of the big mistakes students make is just practice test after practice test after practice test, and there's a lot of issues with that. I talk about this in my study plan videos. You want to do a lot more review and learning, and the tests are really there to improve your stamina and give you a data point, but you really shouldn't be learning through tests. You should be learning through practice sections, through books, through courses, through tutoring, whatever you're doing. That should be the majority of your stuff. But if you got more than 4 months, 30 minutes per day, 4 days per week, that's a good pace. Just be consistent. If you have less than 3 months, then I recommend you to do 1 hour per day, 5 days per week. And here's the thing, this applies through the whole cycle. So if you start with greater than 4 months to go, you can do this through the entire run up to your test. Maybe study a little bit more as the test gets closer, but the benefit of studying early is you don't have to study at this pace later. This is literally, if you start at these points, this is what you should be doing through the whole study plan. If you have less than 1 month, so if you're like starting with not much time left, then I recommend 1.5 hours per day, 6 days per week. Now, again, these are just suggestions, and everyone's got different schedules. Everyone's got different, things that they need to do. And these are averages. Some days you may study a little bit more. Some days you may study less. But the key thing tying all this together is consistency. So if you're in the situation where Monday through Friday, you've got school, you've got sports, you've got extracurriculars, you've got whatever, and so you don't get any SAT or ACT studying done, but then on Saturday or on Sunday you study for 5 hours. That is not going to be as consistent. That's not going to be as effective as studying a little bit, even a half hour each of those days through the week. Building that consistent habit, cramming, even like kind of long-term cramming, just doing a lot of studying on one day. That's not going to get you the learning that you need. Certainly, occasionally you'll have to do like a 4-hour test, and yeah, fine. But you should be spreading out the studying over many days. And, half hour, an hour, consistency is the key. So if you do that, you're going to be, especially long-term, in a really good position to do well. Who versus whom? Okay, so a very specific grammar topic, so I'll definitely talk about this. Who versus whom? So something you'll see on both the SAT and the ACT, more the ACT, but definitely good to know if you're doing both tests. So when do you use which, when do you use who, when do you use whom? So who is going to be used when you're referring to subjects, so particularly doers of action, whereas whom you're going to use when you're referring to objects, in other words, targets of action. So let's go through some examples, because that's really the best way to do it. So let's imagine we had the following sentence. So here's a sentence. I sent out a letter to the people who volunteered for tomorrow's party. So the question is this correct? Is it who? Or should it be whom? And here's how you decide. First thing you do is you look at who and you ask, whom is who referring to? To whom? And it's referring to the people, right? The people who volunteered for the party. And then you ask yourself, okay, were the people the doers of this action? Were they the ones who volunteered? Or were they the targets of the action? Did someone volunteer them? And in this case, they're the ones who volunteered. They are the subjects. They are the people who did this action. They are the ones who volunteered. Therefore, we use who. We use the object form. Here is another example. I sent out a letter to the people who we invited to the party. So again, we ask who. Here's our word. To whom does it refer? It refers to, again, the people. What's the action? Well, these people were invited to the party, right? The people who we invited to the party. So these people are the target of the action. They are the target of the inviting. They are the object of that action. Therefore, this should actually be whom, because they're objects. And that's how you tell. So you ask yourself the question, are the people or things or whatever that who or whom refers to subjects or objects? Are they doers of that action? Or are they objects, targets of it? And that tells you whether you use who or whom. I've got more stuff on this in the ACT English Bootcamp mostly, and I think a little bit in the SAT writing course. So, and some examples from tests, especially on the ACT. Okay. So next question, how to figure out the things that I am doing wrong that basically keep getting the same score without improving much. So it depends on the section. So basically the gist of the question is, my score's not changing much. My score's not improving. What do I do in that situation? So it's really hard to say generally, because you're in that situation where until we can answer the question, what are you getting wrong consistently? Why? Are there concepts or formulas or something that you don't know? Is it reading questions you're getting wrong consistently? Is it an issue of vocabulary? Is it an issue of reading comprehension? Until we know exactly what the errors are, if there are any consistent errors, it's hard to really answer that question. So again, like I said for the previous question, it's first figuring that out. And the challenge with all of this is sometimes a lot of times it's really hard. If you're learning something, it's really hard to know what mistakes you're making because you're learning it, right? How is somebody who's learning something supposed to know what they don't know, right? That's the challenge. And that's where teachers come in, right? Teachers, tutors, friends, any outside voice to be able to give you some insight into what you're doing, because it's very difficult for us with our blind spots and also just our lack of knowledge in the first place. We're learners, to identify that for ourselves. So the main thing I would say in your situation is, if you have a tutor or a teacher, ask them. But if you don't, if that's not an option, if you know of a friend that you can work with on this, if you're part of my study group, you can do this as well on Facebook. Get some outside perspective as much as you can, because it's really hard to do it yourself. Now, sometimes you can. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. It's like, yeah, every time I see an exponent question, I get it wrong. Well, in that case, the answer is clear. And then you have to pursue resources to target that and improve that. But getting that outside feedback will help. I will also say, as a general point, reading reading score can be really hard to budge sometimes because, again, the reading score is based on a skill that you've built up over your entire educational career, your skill of reading. And it'd be like saying this. This is kind of a silly analogy, but it captures the point. It'd be like saying, okay, how do I compete at college level baseball if I've only played baseball like 6 times in my life and I have a month? Can you tell me what to do? It's like an impossible to answer question, right? It's actually probably an impossible to do question. Now, it's not that extreme in reading, but the same idea applies. It's like one or two things in reading, it's just hard to make a move. It depends on the situation, but it's just hard to get movement over a really short period of time. Over a long term, you can. So the main thing is you have to have that long term perspective. If you've been studying for a week or 2 weeks, not the person who answers this question, but in general, if you're somebody who's been studying for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks and nothing's really moving, doesn't mean anything because that's such a short period of time. So keep up the work, keep up the habits, and over time it'll come. For college applications, are scores of the range 1570 to 1600 preferred over the score of 1530 to 1560? So, numbers. So people probably have different opinions on this, and really, you want to ask people in admissions committees. Every school might be a little bit different on this, and you want to get people's feedback in particular cases. In general, not really. I mean, yes and no. I mean, sure. I'd rather have a 1600 than a 1530. I mean, that's kind of obvious. But I think the real gist of the question is there a disproportionate benefit to a 1570 to a 1600, like a non-linear benefit compared to 1530 to 1560? And I don't think so. I think 1530 compared to 1600 is a pretty big difference. But as soon as you're above that 1500 plus region, you're not going to be denied a school because of a 1500, like alone. You're in the conversation. And then your other parts of your application would matter. So, if you were in a scenario where you were competing against someone directly, where your GPA was the same, your extracurriculars were the same, your backgrounds were the same, and then one of you has a higher SAT score than the other, then yeah, probably the higher SAT score wins. But that's such an artificial, unlikely scenario that once you're in that 1500 plus range, you're pretty good. So like the practical question here is, like, let's say you took the SAT and you got a 1530. And the question is, should I try to shoot for a 1600? There's a number of factors that might go into it. I would probably bias in one direction and say, no, it's probably not worth it. There's probably a dozen other things you could do worth your time better than trying to chase a 1600. But again, it depends on your situation. I would ask a friend or a teacher or a tutor or somebody that you know for more feedback on your specific situation, because it might be worth it in rare edge cases, but I don't think in most cases it's going to matter. Okay, we had a question from SAT Test 7. So it's grammar. So just give me a second to put this on the screen. So again, if you haven't done practice test 7 from the SAT, I would highly recommend you not watch this, or at least just kind of turn your brain off and don't really pay much attention. So 43. So again, test 7. If you haven't done this, I recommend turning your brain off for a second, checking Twitter or Facebook or something, whatever you do. Don't pay attention to this so you can get it into it with a fresh mind. So here we go. Pooley and Sokolow describe a more likely scenario. Most people who heard the broadcast understood they were listening to a piece of fiction, but some, being influenced by the sensationalized news coverage afterward, later remembered being more afraid than they had been. So first things first, this word being, this was really common on the old SAT, and it still holds true that whenever you see the word being, it's almost always wrong. I wouldn't say always, but it's usually a sign that things are awry, and that's actually what's going on here. Being is a fragment. It creates basically a wordy, awkward sentence. It doesn't add anything to the sentence. It actually adds confusion, if anything. The other thing we're thinking here in terms of how this read is we have this comma later in the sentence. This is why it's very important to make sure you don't get tunnel vision and just hone in on the underlined portion and just kind of read this again and again and again, because you got to look outside of it. And when we look outside of it, we see this comma is relevant to understanding the structure of the sentence. So we're not going to pick A because being is not working here. In B, we have a comma, which is good. Notice in B and C, we've got a comma, which would seem to make sense given that it's linking with this comma later, so that this phrase in between commas would be like in a positive, or in this case, it looks like a participial phrase. Basically something describing this some people, telling us who this some are, who they are. Because some is basically acting as a pronoun, more or less, an indefinite pronoun, standing in for a group of people, some generic group of people, which are then defined by this following phrase. So the fact that commas come here is good. The problem with B is we're kind of starting a new sentence, and that doesn't make sense. You don't want to have a new independent clause just inserted in the middle of a sentence for no reason. So I would get rid of B. The lack of a comma in D, at least we're getting rid of the being, which is nice, but the lack of a comma in D is a problem because, again, we've got then this kind of orphaned comma. We're in a situation where it's a two or none situation. Either we're going to have two commas or none. And in this case, we're going to have two. So let me just double check. I should have actually checked the answer before I did this because I look like an idiot if the answer isn't C, which happens sometimes, especially when I'm talking, because then I kind of lose track of what I'm doing. And yeah, so this one is C. So that would be the answer. So this is all about sentence structure, comma usage, how you use independent clauses in a sentence, and then also being, not being a good choice. What type of math is going to be on the SAT? So someone already followed up that a big chunk of the test is linear equations. Let me give you the top 5 most important topics that you should be comfortable with for SAT math. And this is totally rough, and this is just off the top of my head, but it's a good place to start. There's more than this, but these are probably the 5 most important things. First thing would be linear equations. Absolutely. So we're talking y equals mx plus b. Finding slopes, y-intercepts, the properties of lines, all that stuff, really important. Second would be word problems and the tactics for solving them, in particular plugging in and translating. So plugging in meaning taking numbers, either your own numbers or numbers from the choices, plugging them into the problem and kind of avoiding algebra. Or if you're going to do it the algebraic way, knowing the ways to translate words into equations or expressions, which you can then solve. So that's huge, big chunk of things. What else? Anything to do with quadratics and factoring, very important. So quadratic formula, factoring quadratics, vertex form, graphing them, ax squared plus bx plus c, axis of symmetry, discriminant, things like that, right? Algebra 1 / algebra 2 stuff you've probably learned in terms of factoring, solving, finding solutions, x-intercepts, y-intercepts, right? Nothing groundbreaking. This isn't calculus. This is stuff that you certainly have done if you're in at least like 10th or 11th grade. And yeah, so definitely important to know that. What else? Percents, huge. Percents and percent change, absolutely critical. Not only because it's all over the test, but also because you probably haven't done anything with percents or percent change in a really long time, maybe middle school. So it just takes a while to remember how all that stuff works and remember the approaches, learn how to translate, learn how to do percent change, all this stuff. And what would be my 5th topic of importance? Pretty steep drop off at this point. We can kind of add fractions in here. That's kind of part of it. Fractions. And then surveys and scatter plots, I guess, would be another one. So how are surveys constructed? What counts as a good survey? What can you conclude from surveys? In terms of experimental design, what are scatter plots? What are best fit lines? How do they relate to the data points? All that kind of stuff you might have learned in like a beginning statistics type class, or maybe Algebra 2 sometimes does a little statistics. Would be pretty good as well. So those are the top 5 topics. There's more, but those are ones you definitely want to have a really good handle on. And as a little plug, I have an SAT math course, which covers everything on this list and more. So I cover all these topics, practice questions. We go through 7 real tests, question by question. You see exactly how to solve all the questions. So SAT math course, go to reasonprep.com and you'll learn more about it there. Go to the courses section of the site and you'll find out more info. So those will be my top 5 topics. Top 5 topics for ACT math. So someone followed up with this. So yeah, let's be ecumenical here. And so top 5 ACT math topics. So here's the thing with ACT math compared to SAT math, and here's a difference between the tests. ACT math is much broader. There's many more topics covered on ACT math than SAT math. It's not even close. There's overlap, but there are a lot of things on ACT math that are either that get more emphasis on ACT math or don't even appear on the SAT. So it's a little bit harder to come out with a list because it's a different type of test, but I will give you, the 5 topics that I think are pretty important to know. And especially one of them is plane geometry, especially circles and triangles, all over the place on the ACT. So, in fact, you know what I'm going to do? Let's make those 2 separate categories because they're both pretty big and they're pretty important. So let's do circles and triangles. Absolutely important for ACT math. Area, perimeter, circumference, isosceles, equilateral, Pythagorean theorem, similar triangles, SOHCAHTOA, trigonometry, all that stuff. Very important for ACT math. What else would we say is important? I mean, again, there's so many topics, it's hard to really nail. It's really like on the SAT, you're going to see the same topics repeated 2 or 3 or 4 times. On the ACT, it's like each test has like 1 or 2 questions from each topic. So it's harder to get like a best of list compared to the SAT. Yeah, I would say factoring would be a big one. So factoring quadratics, etc. So factoring, solving quadratics, just like on the SAT, that's pretty big. Plugging in, especially answers, is a very useful tactic. So there's many ACT questions which you can solve by plugging in the choices into the question and seeing which one works. So knowing when you should plug in the answers, how to do that, the best way to approach it to avoid algebra can save you a lot of effort. What would be number 5? Yeah, I'd say fractions and percents, just because it's stuff that you just haven't done very often recently, probably. So making sure you're really solid on fractions and percents, just like with SAT, is pretty important. So I would say those would be the top 5. Again, if you want to learn more about all these, I've got an ACT Math Bootcamp course on reasonprep.com. I cover all these topics. Practice questions, we go through in the ACT Math Bootcamp 5 tests, and then throughout the entire ACT Math courses that I have on my site, I go through 13 complete ACT Math tests, question by question. So you get plenty of review of all these topics in all those videos. So if you want to learn more about that, check out that course. If my last year is 2018, will colleges take my March or May 2018 scores, or depends on the college? So the colleges will take whatever scores you send them. And every college has its different policies. Some colleges want to see all your school scores. Some will let you pick and choose which ones you can send them. So they'll take whatever you send them. So it depends on the college, yes, but they're not going to like disqualify your March scores or anything. So some will require you to send them all. So in that case, they'll see both your March and your May. Others will ask you for to send whatever you want. So you could pick which one or tests were your best and send those. They'll never, your scores are good for, I think it's 5 years. So you're never going to run out of time to send any given test score in, assuming you're following the kind of standard application track. So you should be good. Just so everybody knows, we have a 10-minute warning. I will be leaving at 6 o'clock my time, which is about 10 minutes from now. So just so you know. My SAT exam is on Saturday, and reading and writing is 95% completed. Just needed to review. Math is 100%, scoring 800. I've not started the essay portion. Okay, so basically it looks like what to do with the essay in 5 days. What to do on the essay with 5 days to study to go for an above average score. Most important thing would be to watch my essay course. It's available for free on Reason Prep, so no excuses. Everyone should watch it. It's relatively short. I tried to make it as concise as possible. In that course, there's also templates and cheat sheets, basically things that will help you know how to write the best essay. So learn that template. Learn what I think, at least, is the best way to approach the essay, the best structure, what you should include, what you shouldn't, things to focus on. That would be the most important thing to do in 5 days. If you're a member of my site, which I think that you are, who asked this question, you can get SAT essay grading from me. So this is for members of my site who have purchased all 8 SAT courses, for example. They can get SAT guiding. You can get SAT grading from me. So this person in the chat, since you're a member, you can send me your essays and I'll give you a grade and written feedback. And then any of you out there who also want SAT essay grading, go to reasonprep.com. You can learn about options of getting essay grading from me. I grade the essay and I give you written feedback on what to do to improve. Any tips for breaking down or understanding complicated passages on the reading part? So again, one that depends a lot on the passage because every passage is different. So one thing that might help with one passage may not be very helpful for another. We'll repeat some of what I've said earlier about this, not today, but just in general, because it's really the same kind of advice applies to these. So the first thing would be focus on questions. Let the questions do the work for you in the sense of telling you what's important and what's not. The danger of kind of worrying about understanding complicated passages, the possible danger is spending time trying to understand something that they don't ask a question about. If, for example, the first paragraph is 15 lines long and there are somehow no questions about that first paragraph, potentially trying to fully understand that first paragraph may not be a good use of your time. Certainly, if there's a general question that covers the passage as a whole, maybe somewhat understanding that first paragraph might matter. But again, the focus should be on what questions do they ask and answer those questions, rather than going into the passage assuming we need to understand every single word and then go to the questions. Let the questions be the guide for you. Let them tell you what is important and what's not, what you should understand and what's not. And then when they give a question, you can know, okay, if there's a question about lines 9 to 13, let me focus in on that a lot more. Beyond that, again, it depends on the passage. What might be some other things we could do for breaking down the passages? Part of it is, and this goes with focusing on the questions, is read the essay when you're going through the questions. Read the passages paragraph by paragraph. You should be doing that naturally as you're working through the questions. This is the strategy that I teach. As you're working through the questions, you're reading through the passage simultaneously. And how it usually works out is you're basically reading a paragraph at a time. And what that helps you do is chunk it down naturally. Because the big danger, and again, everyone's got their different approaches, different strategies, and if something's working for you, I don't want to tell you to change it. But if you don't have a strategy that works for you for reading, and this applies to some extent for the ACT reading as well, I don't recommend opening up the test booklet, starting from line 1, reading all the way to line 80, and then going to questions. For all different kinds of reasons, which I won't go into now, that's not the best way to approach things. Instead, you go to the questions, you find the first specific question you can, you read until you can answer that one, then move on to the next specific, read until you can answer that one. So you're reading in chunks. And that can help you break down the passage rather than kind of reading this whole monstrous beast and trying to understand the whole thing at once. That's really hard to do. So those would be 2 tips I would give. Focus on questions, and in focusing on questions, read the passage in paragraph chunks. That can make a big difference in turning a complicated passage into manageable tasks. Beyond that, it gets down into reading comprehension, sentence structure, argumentation of the passage. It's more complicated once you get into the nitty gritty of it. But as an overall bird's eye view, this would be a good place to start. Okay, maybe 1 or 2 more questions. What is your passage strategy? Please show as a flowchart. So I don't have a flowchart I can just show you immediately, but I kind of ran through it a little bit. So this will be, I assume you mean for SAT reading. And I go into more detail about this. Plugging alert. That I go into more detail about this in my reading course, but let me give you the general outlines of what this looks like. Step 1, read the blurb. So read the little thing at the top, the italicized portion. That sometimes contains important information. 2, find the first specific question. 3, read passage until you answer that question. 4, find second specific question. I'm sorry, my handwriting is terrible. Partly it's terrible, but I'm also trying to write fast. Find the second specific question. 5, continue reading. Probably should have typed this. From where you left off and answer the cue. Repeat this until you finish all your specific questions, then go back and do general questions. Main idea at the end. By the time you get to step 7, you should have probably read the entire passage in the process of answering the specifics. By the time you've done that, you've read the whole passage, you should be ready to answer, or more prepared to answer, a general or main idea question. That is the basic approach. So notice nowhere in this strategy, in my strategy at least, do I have anything about, for the SAT at least, reading through the whole passage first. I won't go into details why. My reading course, I explain why I think this is the best way to do it, and others will disagree. You'll probably hear elsewhere people tell you to read the passage. Whatever. I mean, try it. In the end, everyone has different likes and dislikes. Things work better for some people, better for others. So try out different methods. See what you're more comfortable with. Develop some hybrid of your own. Whatever works for you, you're going to discover through practice. Now, I will defend this strategy vigorously because I think there's really good reasons why it works. But, experiment. Take this, take another method, take your own method, play around, see what you find most comfortable. You also might adjust based on the passage. You might consider reading the fiction passage through first, right? That might be an exception. Do read the fiction passage and then go to the questions. So it depends. There are all these variables, but this is a good foundation. Okay, so a few very quick questions, and then I'm going to wrap up. Is confidence interval tested for the SAT? Allegedly, in some of the documents, it seems like they have it there. I've never seen it. So confidence interval, margin of error, that kind of thing. I haven't seen it, even though I guess technically they can ask about it. I would be surprised, to be honest, if they ever put anything like that on the test. And anything more than maybe the most basic level. Because confidence interval stuff, no one learns that. Well, I shouldn't take that back. Maybe that's something new now with Common Core, but it's not something that is super common, and I would be surprised if they did, because that's so inside baseball that I don't understand why they would ask that. Conditional probability, yes, that is tested. So conditional probability absolutely is on the test. I've seen it in previous tests. So yeah, you'll definitely want to learn that. Conditional probability is basically finding the probability of subsets of groups. So given a bunch of students, 9th through 12th grade, males and females, what is a probability that if you select a 9th grader that they will be male? Things like that, where you're breaking down these groups into smaller subsets and finding probabilities. That's something that you definitely would see. Final question: how occasionally do I do these streams? So this week, before the May test, I'm definitely gonna have one. TBD on the exact day and time. Did I spell that right? Oh my gosh, definite. Okay, definitely one. Date and time to be determined. Hopefully two. And I think what I'm going to try to do is maybe one on Friday, because I expect with all the procrastinators, etc., that Friday would be super popular. I would recommend, I'm definitely going to have one on Friday and then hopefully one earlier in the week. So if you really want to get your question in, I'm guessing the one earlier in the week will be less attended, but who knows? So definitely one, hopefully two. A few housekeeping. The recording for the session will be up on YouTube basically right after I end this. I'm going to have a condensed version of this that I'm going to probably upload on Tuesday, most likely, which will go through some more, which will basically cut this down into something a bit more watchable. There'll be timestamps. And then, yeah, so that'll hopefully be out by Tuesday. If you are part of my Facebook study group, if you are on my mailing list for my website, if you are subscribed to me on YouTube, you will get the announcements for when I'm going to have the next live stream session. So just pay attention to either YouTube, Facebook. You can also like my Facebook page. You'll get info there. Or if you're part of my mailing list, you go to the live stream side of my website. You can join the mailing list for this. You'll get the updates. So probably something like Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday, something like that. Probably in the evening would be my guess. So thanks so much for coming to the session. And like I said, we'll have a couple hopefully next week. And we'll hopefully do well on that test. So thanks so much for coming. And talk to you all next time.